Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks so much for taking time out of your day today. On behalf of Vivvi, I'm so happy to welcome you today. I'm Rachel Duda, the Vice President of Learning at Vivvi, and I'm so excited to talk about sleep and how to get more of it. As a mom of four, I have four young children. I've tried every strategy out there, and I know how confusing, frustrating, and very, very tiring it is trying to figure out what works for your child and how everyone is going to get a good night's sleep. So whether you have a baby, a toddler, or even an older child, or maybe like me, all of the above, today we're so lucky to be joined by Hadley Seward, certified pediatric sleep consultant and founder of Bonne Nuit Baby. We're going to talk about everyone's favorite topic, sleep, sleep training. But she's also going to address tons of pressing questions about sleep, from overnight feeds to room sharing and much more. So stick around and get your questions ready. I'm sure you'll have lots, and get ready to get some better sleep tonight, hopefully. If you're not already familiar with Vivvi, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of what we do. We are on a mission to reinvent childcare and early learning for today's families. We currently have 5 campuses in New York City, including new campuses in Dumbo and Midtown West. And they specialize in learning and care for ages 6 weeks to 5 years old. We also partner with employers of all sizes to bring childcare and early learning to their working parents as a benefit. And we truly believe, and it's our mission to support the entire family, not just with high quality care and learning, but also with education and resources for those early years, which is why we're hosting this conversation today. Before we get started, I just wanted to share a few program logistics with all of you. We'll have about 45 minutes together. We'll spend 30 minutes running through some questions and slides with Hadley, and then we'll dive into some of the questions that you might have. So our chat function is open, so feel free to drop a question anytime during this webinar, and we'll do our very best to get to as many as we can. And finally, before we dive in, I just want to acknowledge that sleep is a huge topic, and there's no way that we will cover everything in these 45 minutes, but I promise you that you'll walk away with at least one practical, applicable tool that will help you feel more equipped for whatever's coming your way. With that, let's dig in. Hadley, I'd love if you could start by talking about everyone's favorite topic, sleep training. It's probably one of the most controversial topics in parenting. Should it be? And can you give us some of the basics of what sleep training is, and whether it's healthy for your baby and family?
Yeah, and just to give everyone a quick overview of what we're going to cover, we're going to start by talking about the 3 pillars of healthy sleep, which, just talk a little bit about their sleep training, but there are also other aspects of sleep that will support sleep training. We'll talk about what is sleep training, how do you choose a method, some myth versus facts when it comes to sleep training, things I get asked all the time. And then we'll open it up to Q&A as well.
Great.
So this is what I call the 3 pillars of healthy sleep. And this is really important, especially for babies 4 months and older and toddlers as well. So kind of the ages 4 months and older. So there's the sleep environment. So where your baby's sleeping, the sleep schedule, when your baby's sleeping or your toddler, and then independent sleep. So the idea that your baby can fall asleep on their own. I know we're here today to talk about sleep training, but I never like to talk about sleep training without also talking about sleep environment and sleep schedule, because we really want to optimize both the sleep environment and the sleep schedule, either before we sleep train or as we sleep train. So I'm not going to get super into each one, but just really quickly, in terms of sleep environment at home, obviously at daycare is going to be different, or when you're out and about in the world, but at home, your baby is going to sleep best in a very dark, cool, quiet sleep space. So in an ideal world, it would be like pitch black for naps, pitch black for nighttime as well, right? That's going to help their body understand that it's time to sleep and start to produce melatonin, which makes them more drowsy. So it's going to make them that's going to make them sort of ready for sleep. And then you also want to have an age-appropriate sleep schedule. And obviously this differs by age. After 4 months, we're really looking to start the day kind of between 6 and 7 a.m. We're ending daytime sleep by 5. And then the one thing that I work with a lot of families, the one thing that I find oftentimes is the case with sleep schedules is bedtime is too late. And the baby or the toddler is overtired, and then they fight bedtime and they can't go to sleep, or they wake up 30 minutes later, or, it's a mess. So I always tell people when I'm working with them, if you're going to sleep train, do what you can to ensure that your baby's not overtired while you're doing that, right? Because we want to set them up for success. We want them to have an optimized sleep environment. So super dark, cool, and quiet. And we want to make sure we're getting them to bed early, especially during the sleep training, right? We don't, if your child is already overtired and you're trying to sleep train however you do it, it's going to be much more difficult, right? So you can really set them up for success by getting them into bed early before you kind of start to see those sleepy cues. And then there's independent sleep. So which we'll talk about more on the next slide. So sort of what is independent sleep and what is sleep training? So what is sleep training? Big picture, sleep training is taking one form of parental response and replacing it with another one. So the parental response, it's usually what we call sleep association. So things that your baby needs to have in place to fall asleep. So I've listed a bunch of them. For example, feeding to sleep, rocking to sleep, bouncing, they must be in the carrier for naps, which was my second child. They have to be in the stroller for naps. For older kids who are in toddler beds, laying next to them while they fall asleep. Those are all kind of what we would call sleep associations, right? For some families, they work, right? Like I talk to parents that are like, yeah, of course I feed my baby to sleep at bedtime. I love that. That's our time. They love it. I love it. And that's great, right? And there's, oftentimes there's no need to change that if it's working for both the parent and the baby. However, oftentimes at some point, and it'll differ by baby or by toddler when this happens, but the response that you're giving stops working, and it might not work for the baby. Like, let's say, for example, you are rocking your baby to sleep, you transfer them into their crib or their bassinet, they sleep all night, life is amazing. And then one day you try to transfer them and they wake up. So you rock them to sleep for a little bit longer, and then you do it again and they wake up. Right? So it's like, okay, this just doesn't work anymore. The strategy isn't working anymore. And then sometimes it doesn't work for the parent. So sometimes, if you have a 4-year-old, for example, and they want you to lay next to them for 2 hours while they go to sleep, and you need those 2 hours to do other things, that doesn't work for you. Or a personal example, when my daughter, when she was a couple of months old, she would only nap in the carrier because I had an older child and all of her naps were in the carrier because we were running after him. And I went to the doctor and he was like, you cannot do this anymore. Like your body is slowly breaking down. Like your baby's getting bigger. Like you can't do this anymore. So the reason to sleep train, which is a big question, why would one need to sleep train, is when response A, when the sleep association, whatever it is, when it no longer works for the baby or child and or the parent, right? So then what you're doing is you're changing your response. And that, again, it's a huge range of things. You could go from feeding to sleep to rocking to sleep, right? You could go from bouncing to sleep to doing time checks, like Ferber method. You could go from laying next to them in bed to sitting by the door, right? So whatever response A is, it can be, there's a ladder of different responses that you can use. Some families will choose to do it really gradually. They're like, okay, my baby, my 4-month-old will only eat to sleep. We're going to start off, we're not going to feed to sleep anymore, but we will rock them to sleep. And then once they can do that, then we're going to be putting them in their crib with their hands on their chest, shushing them. And then, you kind of move down that ladder away from sleep, going from kind of sleep association from sleep association to sleep association. And that's okay, right? That's a totally valid way to do it. Other parents are like, we're feeding to sleep. We don't want to do it anymore. We want to go from here down to here. So we're going to go from feeding to sleep to doing time checks, for example, or to doing the chair method, or whatever. And there's no right or wrong. And we'll kind of talk about how to choose the best methods. But I think when we talk about sleep training, I think it's a very loaded term. I'm sure many of you we've all seen the same stuff online about it. Just keep in mind that it is replacing A with B. That's it. It's replacing A with B, and A can be a lot of different things and B can be a lot of different things. So every family is different, and that means that there's not one sleep training method that's going to work for everyone, right? So when you're choosing a sleep training method, there are 3 things you want to take into account, and I would kind of say these are all equal to each other. So the first is a method you feel comfortable with. It might not be like super excited, this is going to be great, but it's something that you feel comfortable with. Equal to that, a method that you can stay consistent with, because consistency is the most important thing when it comes to sleep training. And then the third is going to be a method that best suits your child's temperament. So I'll give you an example of what I mean by that. When I was just talking about sleep training, you might have been like, oh, wow, I can, instead of feeding to sleep, I'm going to rock them to sleep. It's going to be great. It's going to be wonderful. They're going to love this, right? And then you kind of think about it and you're like, oh, they're going to get really mad. I'm there and I'm holding them, but I'm not feeding them, right? That's just going to make things worse, right? So you have to take into account the temperament and personality of your child. So does a more gradual method feel good to you, but your child is more sort of strong-willed, knows what they want, and actually your presence is going to be adding fuel to the fire. So you want to find something you're comfortable with, something you can stay consistent with, but you also have to take into account the personality of your baby when choosing your sleep training method. So sleep training myth versus fact. And before I do this, actually, I wanted just to quickly put out there after 4 months, the 3 sleep training methods I think work the best. There are many, and I'm happy to answer questions about others, but as you're sort of considering it, the 3 methods I find that work best after 4 months, a more hands-on method is going to be called the chair method. And these are all very easy to look up. I'm happy to answer questions, but they're, easy to kind of get more information. So chair method is going to be more hands-on. Time checks or Ferber is going to be kind of middle ground. And then you have totally hands-off, which is going to be extinction or cry it out. There are lots of names for it, right? So again, it's figuring out, are we more hands-on people? Are we more hands-off people? Or are we kind of somewhere in the middle? And you want to take into account what you're comfortable with, and then what you can stay consistent with. And those 2 might not be aligned. And then what your child's going to how your child's going to react. So let's talk about sleep training myths and facts. So oftentimes I'm asked, does sleep training mean that I have to wean overnight because I'm not ready, or my pediatrician says that my baby needs to eat in the middle of the night, or I'm worried about my supply? So sleep training does not necessarily mean that you have to cut out all overnight feeds. Obviously, it depends on the age of the baby. Oftentimes when I work with families who have like 4 to 6 months old, they might choose to keep in a feed, or their pediatrician might recommend they keep in a feed, and that's no problem. So let's say you had a hypothetical 5-month-old who was waking up 8 times overnight, and only one of those was for a full meal. We would focus on all of those other wakings, but keep that feed in there, right? But let's say you have a 12-month-old who probably doesn't need to eat overnight, but is taking 3 full feeds overnight. When you're sleep training, are you just going to yank out 3 meals from the middle of the night? No, you're going to start to, you're going to try to consolidate them, and with the eventual goal of getting rid of them, but it does not necessarily mean just pulling feeds cold turkey. And usually when I work with families, we don't do that. Myth versus fact, there's always crying involved. This is true. And that's because when we replace whatever A is, whatever we're doing, whatever B is, it's not A, right? And your baby or toddler is going to be like, wait a minute, this isn't what we do. This is different. I don't like this, right? And so they have big feelings. And the way that babies and younger toddlers express their feelings is by crying, right? So the way that I look at crying when it comes to sleep training is it is something temporary. When I work with families, my goal is to go from, where the child is with their sleep to what the goal, where the parent wants it to be. to get there as quickly as possible, to minimize that crying. And sometimes that might be minimizing it in terms of number of days, right? Like, let's get this done in 5 days versus let's get this done in 3 weeks with, you know, medium crying along the way versus more crying in 2 days or 3 days or whatever it is. But it depends on what the family's comfortable with, what they're going to stay consistent with, and the temperament of their child. So if you're going into sleep training, I would assume there's going to be a few rough nights. And what you need to do is remind yourself that it's not, I think that like when we hear a baby crying, you know, we're wired to be like, there's an emergency, let's go. That's what we're hardwired as parents to do. I think it's important to remember that it might, you know, they might be frustrated. They might be angry. They might be like, hey, where are you? Hello, I'm here. And they might feel discomfort of, oh, wow, this is new. I've never had to do this before. So for those of you who have older children who have done potty training, sleep training is very similar to potty training in that I remember when my son was potty training, he was totally refusing it. And I was like, why would he ever pee in the potty when he could just pee in his diaper? Like, why is that a thing? Like, of course he's not going to do that. And then one day he peed, right? And it's not that it's like with potty training, it's not that they are terrified to do it. It's just like, well, that seems like a lot of work. Why would I do that? And sleep training is really similar, right? So another myth is that sleep training takes weeks or months and has to be redone frequently. Done correctly and consistently, depending on the method, sleep training is quick. So typically when I work with families, bedtime and overnight actually are the easiest parts of sleep to work with. And that's because the sleep drive is strong. Naps are more difficult because the sleep drive is not as strong. Bedtime and overnight, they're ready to sleep. They're going to fall asleep. So typically when I work with families, if we're doing something like time checks, like the Berber method, good to go in about a week. Now that does not mean going from like 5 full feeds to no feeds, but that means like they know how to fall asleep by themselves at bedtimes. We've made progress with those feeds. We're consolidating them. You know, maybe we get it down to like 1 overnight feed, but done correctly, sleep training should not take weeks or months. And if it is, most likely there's something off. It could be that the sleep schedule is off and they're so overtired that they're not set up for success. It could be that the parent is not being consistent unintentionally. You know, they're doing something that is reinforcing the crying and the response. So in general, sleep training should be, I always say it's kind of like quick and dirty. You just want to like get through it as quickly as possible. In terms of it having, like a lot of people are like, why would I bother sleep training? Because they're going to have a sleep regression. We're going to travel in 4 months. You know, they're going to get sick. There definitely are, we'll call them major life events that can knock sleep off track. There are sleep regressions, you know, they're not that often, but they do exist. You know, we do travel, kids do get sick. So sleep can get off track, but it doesn't mean that, oh, I have to sleep train you again. Here's 2 more weeks of crying. It might mean, for example, like let's say your child was sick. And of course you want to be more responsive overnight, even if they were, you know, normally you're super hands off. If they're sick, you throw the rules out of the window, you're being more responsive to them. If, for example, you're up with them all night and then they get better and it's been 2 weeks, are they going to expect you to come hang out with them in the middle of the night? Yes, they will. Absolutely. Right. And so it's more kind of a reset. It's like, okay, you're better, or we're home from our trip, right? Or sleep regression is over. It's more of a quick reset. And sleep trained babies, they figured they're like, they might kind of protest at first, but then they're like, oh, okay, all right. I remember what we used to do. All right. I got it. Right. So it's more of a quick reset versus like re-sleep training. Myth versus fact. Sleep training is a right choice for everyone. Of course it's not, right? Every single family has to make this choice. Some families proactively sleep train. They're like, okay, you're 4 months, like, let's figure this out. Some families wasn't something that they planned on doing, but they've really hit rock bottom. Either in terms of my child literally wakes up every 30 minutes all night and they are exhausted, and this clearly is not good for them. or I have to go to work tomorrow and I can't do this anymore. Like I'm, the endorphins from the birth are gone. It's been a few months. I'm really tired and I can't do this. So it's not the right choice for everyone. You should never feel pressured to sleep train. It really is something that you have to go, once you're ready to do it, you kind of have to go all in on it. And so you have to wait for that moment where you're like, okay, yes, like this is the time, let's do this. We're ready to go. And for some families that never happens, or for some families it doesn't, there's no need to do it until your child is 4 and they're leaving their bed every 20 minutes overnight or whatever, right? So there's no time, there's no age by which you must do it. And and it just doesn't work anymore. It might look different for an older child versus a younger baby. But it's really a very personal decision if you want to do it, when and how. Myth or fact, you should start sleep training with bedtime overnight. Absolutely. Obviously bedtime and overnight is great and you don't need to do anything, but you do need to work on naps. You would start with naps. Most commonly it's everything. It's naps and bedtime overnight. So you always want to start with bedtime and overnight, and that's because the sleep drive is strong. So we have that on our side. Some families will choose to do all sleep at once. So they'll start with bedtime overnight, next day start in with nap training. Other families will kind of split it up. So they'll start with bedtime and overnight, do that for a couple of nights. It doesn't have to be perfect, but once you're like, okay, you have figured this out. It's not 100%, but I can tell that you have this, then you start in with the naps after that. And then the biggest question that is out there lurking on the internet, and then I get asked about that often, is does sleep training affect the secure attachment with your baby? There is no evidence that sleep training impacts attachment in any way. You're still responding. It just looks different, right? So it might be, for example, you're not feeding to sleep, but you are sitting next to the crib. That might not be the response your baby would like you to give, but you are still there, right? Or if you're doing checks, your baby's like very aware that you're there. You might not be there every single second, but you're checking in frequently, right? And I would really think about sleep training more about learning a new skill, and they're learning a new skill in the safety of a familiar and loving space, right? So our babies and toddlers are in loving environments all day long, whether that be at daycare, at home, wherever they are, they're in the loving environments. And that doesn't end at bedtime. It just looks different at bedtime because we are teaching them a new skill. Again, it's kind of like potty training in that it really is a skill that they're learning, that they're going to kind of keep in their brains for the rest of their lives. Yeah, so that's kind of the more formal presentation. And I know we kind of have we have some questions that were sent in advance, and I'm happy to answer other questions.
I was having so many flashbacks when you were talking, and I remember as a new parent, my biggest fear when I was on the journey of sleep training my child was the upstairs neighbors. Like, oh my God, they're going to hear them crying. So I remember walking upstairs with a 12-pack of beer and a bottle of whiskey because they were like young 20-something-year-old guys, and saying, I'm so sorry, you might hear my baby crying for a few days.
There's a white noise machine and some wine.
Yeah, exactly. Like those are the things as a parent that you think about, that causes anxiety. So thank you for that. We're going to jump into some questions that were sent in beforehand. And one of the questions that we got was about sleeping at daycare. And as you can imagine, it's a very hot topic here at Vivvi. I can't tell you how many parents are absolutely convinced that their child will never sleep at daycare. And I truly empathize with how stressful that is. You did a great blog post for us recently on how to smooth the sleep transition when your child starts daycare. Can you share some of your best tips with us?
Yeah. So, and my family's also, when I'm working with them, they will bring this up, and I've had families be like, should I just get a nanny? Like, I like the idea of daycare, but, I mean, it's a big transition to go to daycare. It's a different routine. It's a different sleep environment. Most likely sleep will get disrupted the first couple of weeks, right? And even if your child is like a super sleeper at daycare, it's still exhausting being there, because in a good way, they're having fun. They're like, oh my gosh, like my new friends and like these new people and their new toys, right? It's a lot of fun. So my number one tip when transitioning to daycare is assume your child is going to come home exhausted at the end of the day and plan on an early bedtime. It's not advice I like to give. I mean, I do give it, but it's not something I enjoy giving, because I know that if your child is starting daycare, for many parents, you're going back to work. This is the longest you've been separated from your baby. And so I hate being like, yeah, just put them to bed once, just go for it. Just, you don't need to hang out with them. But I do find that those first few weeks, I would say get them to bed early. Even if they slept well, they're still gonna be really tired. Get them to bed early and really make the morning kind of your special quality time. If you're getting home and you have to do solids and you have to bathe them, if you have a lot going on, I would focus on just kind of getting them to bed, and then make the morning time kind of your one-on-one, let's read a book, let's hang out, kind of make that your time. I think the biggest, just in talking to families and just how I personally felt when my child started daycare, I think the biggest change is that, especially for parents who are on maternity or paternity leave, is we had total control over our child's schedule. Like we had control over everything, insofar as you can have control, and we're passing that off into someone else. And so I would say, just remember that at daycare, the team there, that like you're all one team, everyone wants the same thing. And so start conversations. Obviously there are going to be things you can't control, like the sleep environment's going to be different. That's okay. Sleep schedule is probably also going to be different. That's also okay. So kind of keep doing what you're doing at home on non-daycare days, like the weekends. Keep doing what works. And it's okay if it's different at daycare. And just trust that your child's going to figure it out. It might take a little while, but most of the time they figure it out.
Thanks for that. I was just talking to a colleague that has their new baby at Vivvi, and she said it was a 2-week transition. She wasn't sleeping well at home, but within those 2 weeks, she figured it out, and all is smooth and going well now.
Awesome.
What about some other common sleep transitions, like dropping night feeds, getting rid of the swaddle? I was so concerned about that as a parent. Or even moving a toddler from a crib to a bed. Is there a good time to attempt these transitions, or do we avoid them? Yeah.
Never do any transitions. Just avoid them forever. In terms of babies, in terms of things like moving them from their bassinet to their crib, or starting the unswaddling process, or those types of things, contrary to, I believe, what popular opinion is, that we should start at nap time, because like who wants to mess up overnight sleep? Start with bedtime. And again, it's because the sleep drive is strong. So if you unswaddle your baby, they're much more likely to eventually fall asleep at bedtime than they are at nap time. So even though it feels weird, because you're like, I must, we're hardwired, where it's like must protect overnight sleep, for these big transitions, you're going to actually want to start at bedtime. In terms of unswaddling, which just for safety reasons really needs to be done either when the baby's showing signs of rolling, sort of the jerky movement that they try to get onto their side. So even before they're rolling, but they're showing signs of it, time to start unswaddling, or they're escaping their swaddle. Like you wake up and they're kind of escaping. It's time to unswaddle. The only time where you can kind of disregard that is if your baby's in a snoo and they're kind of still attached down into the snoo, then obviously they can't roll in the snoo. So it's okay to keep them like that. But yeah, for unswaddling, start at night, know that it will disrupt sleep. And that's because all of a sudden your baby has like hands and they're just like, who's hitting me? What's going on? What is this? Right? It's like if you had your legs were tied together and then all of a sudden you have 2 legs, right? It's weird. And so it will disrupt sleep. It feels like they will never sleep again, but they literally just have to be like, what's going? Oh, I'm just going to like chew on my hand. That's nice. Right. So it feels like they're never going to figure it out. And then they figure it out all of a sudden. In terms of transitioning from bassinet to the crib, that actually is usually a very easy transition. Typically by the time we're doing that, your baby's like, wow, I have all this space to roll around. This is amazing, right? So we as parents get very nervous about transitioning from the bassinet to the crib, but it usually goes pretty smoothly, provided that both sleep environments are similar. So if you're going from a super dark sleep environment with the bassinet to a super, even if it's in a different room, a super dark room with the crib. It usually goes pretty easily. And then when we go from crib to bed, I want to strongly advise everyone out there thinking about this, that your 2-year-old is not yet ready for a bed. They need to still be in the crib. I highly, highly recommend waiting until at least 36 months to transition from the crib to the bed. Even if you're just converting the crib into a toddler bed, really try to wait until 36 months at the earliest, just because that's when they're more developmentally ready for that. It's a big transition for us. We're like, whatever, I took off a side, like put up a railing. What's the difference? But to them, they're like, these 4 railings have been here my whole life. Like, this is my safe place, and a side's gone now. And so it can actually make separation anxiety a lot worse. It can cause a lot of issues. So try to wait until at least 36 months. If your 3-year-old is loving the crib and they still are within the height weight restriction of the crib, no need to rush them out into a bed. If you're changing to a bed because you're giving a younger sibling the crib and your baby is not yet 3, I would think twice about that, because most likely they're going to be like, this interloper over here just stole my bed from me. And that's going to cause problems. So that doesn't mean, if you're a few months shy of 3 years, does that mean you have to go buy 2 cribs? No, but oftentimes, babies will be in bassinets, or they could be in a pack and play, or, there are ways to do it without buying 2 like fancy cribs. But yeah, those are I'm just trying to think of other big transitions. I mean, obviously there are a lot. In general, if you have a new sibling on its way, or, you want to avoid any other big transitions. So, like, you don't want to potty train right then. You don't want to sleep train. So for example, in terms of sleep training, if people call me all the time and they're like, I'm due in a month and my child is not, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm like, we need to start right now. Right. If you do need to do any big transitions like potty training, sleep training, et cetera, ideally you would do that a month or 2 before the baby's born, or well after the baby's born, because we don't want the child to associate this thing with the arrival of their new sibling.
Right. Makes so much sense. Another hot sleep question that we get, particularly in New York City, where space is so limited, is that idea of sibling room sharing. If you're planning on putting both kids in a room together, how can you get them into a healthy sleep routine, even if they're at different developmental stages?
Yeah. So usually, and in most of the families I work with are in some large city somewhere where, it's not like I sleep in the West Wing and the children are in the East Wing. Like, we're all on top of each other. We usually want a shared room at some point. Usually the children will start out separately because the toddler or the older child is in what is the nursery, and then the baby's in the parents' room. So I would say use that time where they're separated. Like, once okay, like, I'd like for them to be sleeping in the same room at some point, you want their sleep to be solid before you make that happen, right? So for example, if you have a 4-year-old who's jumping out of bed 16 times a night and you want to move your 6-month-old into that room, that's probably not going to go well. So I would work on, in that hypothetical example, I would work on your 4-year-old sleep first before you move, or vice versa. And sometimes it's both. In terms of when a younger child can move, like the appropriate age for a baby to move in with their older sibling, I would look for the baby sleeping through the night pretty reliably. The only exception is if they had like one very reliable overnight feed. Like, if they always wake up at like 1, you feed them, they go back to sleep. That's early enough in the night where it's probably not going to wake up the sibling. If you had a 5:30 feed, that's probably going to wake up the older sibling, and like, who knows if they're going to go back to sleep. Right. Right. So it kind of, when you can move one child with the other depends on how they're sleeping. I also have 2 children. For many years, they were in the same room. We finally separated them because one's an early bird and one's a night owl. And it was just like driving me crazy. And they both weren't getting enough sleep. But with with me personally, and just families that I work with, if you have children sharing a room, there are going to be times where you need to work on something going on with their sleep, right? When you need to do that, you want to move the more flexible sleeper at that moment out for a couple of nights, not forever, so that you can work on the one child's sleep without having to worry about how it's affecting the other one. Right.
Yeah.
The other sort of hack I have for room sharing is, I think once we are in the same room, parents oftentimes, just for like logistics sake, and like, I don't know, we see it on social media and think it's a thing, we try to get them to the same bedtime. It obviously depends on the age, but most ages, just if you think about logistically in terms of like how long you like carry a baby and then it's born, most age differences between siblings, they're not going to naturally end up with the same bedtime. So you end up either putting one to bed early or usually keeping one up late, keeping up the younger one so that they go to sleep at the same time as the older one. I would say if it's logistically possible, if they need to go to bed at different times, like follow their lead, right? Like instead of kind of forcing them into one bedtime, I think most kids do better when the bedtime routines are separate. Again, if it's possibly logistically. Oftentimes I'm the only parent at home at bedtime. And so I do my son's bedtime and then I do my daughter's bedtime right after that, right? So they go to bed kind of around the same time, but they each have their own bedtime routine. It's nice in terms of giving them one-on-one attention. I also find that when siblings are doing bedtime routine when they're younger, not if you have like a, 11 and 14-year-old or something, but when they're younger, oftentimes if they're doing the bedtime routine together, they're just like riling each other up, which is not like, we want the energy between dinner and bedtime. We want it to be going like this. If they're like splashing each other in the bath or like arguing over the book or like chasing each other around or whatever, like that's not the energy we want at bedtime. So I find that it's easier to keep things like low key and calm when the bedtime routine is separated.
Welcome to bedtime at the Duda house with children ranging from 4 to 9.
Yeah.
So speaking of room sharing, I know many parents just can't get their child out of their room. How do you even go about getting your toddler or preschooler out of your bed?
Yeah. So it's going to depend on how old they are. It's going to depend on kind of what the situation is, but it's the same. I mean, it's exactly what we were talking about earlier. We take situation A, which is they're in your bed and it's no longer working. And it might be because they're kicking you all night or they're not getting enough sleep or whatever. Maybe you just want your bed back. So you have situation A and you're replacing it with something else. So, it could, for families that, for example, have been bed sharing since birth, this is like a thing that they've been doing for a long time. You might want to do it super gradually. You might start, for example, with a crib or wherever they're going to sleep eventually, that mattress on your floor, right? So they're not in your bed, but they're next to you. And then you go, okay, you're going to be in your bed. I will sleep with you for a few nights. And then you kind of like move yourself out of the room. If it's a new thing, if it's like, oh, they were sick and they had a fever and I brought them to bed and now it's like, that's the only place they want to be. If it's a newer thing, it's more about kind of setting expectations, setting boundaries, and then really enforcing them. So once we get into sleep training looks a lot different once we get into kind of 3, 4, or 5-year-olds. And that's because it's partly, let's figure out the sleep schedule. Let's figure out the sleep environment. Let's come up with a plan. But a lot of it is setting firm but loving boundaries and then enforcing them. And the hardest time to do that is bedtime because we're tired, like we're over it, like as parents, like I struggle with that as well. And so it's really figuring out a plan that feels like realistic and doable where you're like, can I do this at 7 p.m. when like I just want to go to bed too? Like, it's figuring it out and then really, really staying consistent, because once they hit like 2.5, 3, that one time you make an exception, like game over. They're going to remember that for the rest of their lives. They're going to be like, but when I was 6 years ago, you did this. So that's not a super black and white answer, but because as children get older, it really does get a lot more customized in terms of what the situation is and, the comfort level of the parent, and then figuring out a plan that they can stay consistent with, because that's the most important part.
Absolutely. Excuse me. So when our children aren't sleeping, we're also not getting adequate sleep as parents. Can you share some strategies that will allow parents to get sleep, even if our children are giving us a hard time with sleep?
Yeah. I would say one of the biggest barriers to parents getting enough sleep is that once our kids finally fall asleep, however they do it, is that our cup is totally depleted. We have nothing left. And so we're like, just going to go watch Instagram or like Netflix, or I'm going to like scroll through TikTok because like we want to do something for us. And so I think parents end up staying, there's like a name for it that's escaping me right now, but we essentially end up staying up really late because we're like, play next, play next, play next. So I think part of it is really looking at the role of technology in your evening. And I'm super guilty of this. I totally lay in bed, like doom scrolling. But I think looking like kind of like, is you watch your one episode of whatever, and then it's like play next, just be like, is it gonna help or is this gonna hurt? And sometimes you're like, no, today was terrible. Like, I need this mentally. And then other times you're like, okay, if I watch one more episode, like I'm going to be up till 2 a.m. Like, I just need to go to bed. It's helpful to set kind of a little bedtime routine for yourself. Even if it's like, okay, like my personal goal is I try to be physically in my bed around 10. I don't go to sleep then, but I'll read or look at my phone, but I'm physically in bed. Ideally reading, like reading's a great way to wind down. Oftentimes, like reading isn't like looking at social media or whatever. You're not like getting a dopamine rush. So oftentimes, like once you feel that like, I could go to sleep now, if you just like shut your book or turn off your Kindle and like turn off the lights, you're more likely just to kind of go to sleep.
I'm in bed by 9:30 every night because I know I need the sleep.
That's awesome. Yeah.
So we got a bunch of questions submitted to us beforehand, and one of the questions that came up a lot was about the snoo. What do you think about that? And is it really the magic bullet for sleep? And if not, is there any such thing?
I mean, no, I don't think there's in general any sort of like magic bullet. The snoo is great though. Just from what I see anecdotally working with a lot of families using it, some babies love it. Some babies like seem to hate it. And then some are just like, whatever, they don't care. A lot of companies now are offering it sort of as a benefit, like they'll get a snoo for parents. So and you can rent it now. I used to be much more judicious about recommending it because it's really expensive. But now that you can rent it, it makes it more affordable. If it doesn't work, you're like, okay, returning this, like getting a regular bassinet. So, I think that it could be worth a try. Your baby might hate it, but that's the case with most things that you buy for a baby, is that there's like a 90% chance that they're going to hate it. I've never personally used one. They weren't really a thing when my kids were that age. I don't want to make it sound like it's something you have to do. Your child's not going to sleep, because I don't think that's the case at all. But there's nothing wrong with the snoo. A lot of people worry that like, oh my gosh, my baby is going to be a nightmare to transfer to the crib, et cetera. As long as you're using it the way that you should be using it, like meaning that when the time comes, you're doing like the wean down mode that kind of like starts to get them used to less rocking and stuff like that. It's going to be fine. I think they recommend sort of transferring out of the snoo around 6 months. I would actually recommend 5 months at the latest. Like a lot of my clients will do it at 4 months. Like when sleep just starts to get crazy, it's like, okay, let's get them out of the snoo and like fix everything at once. Because the problem with the snoo is that, I mean, it's not a problem, but one of the reasons the snoo works is because the baby is attached in there. And so it can like be rocking them. But depending on the baby, starting somewhere between like 3 and 6 months, they start to figure out how to roll. Will this disrupt sleep temporarily? Yes, but it's something they're going to want to practice in the middle of the night. So oftentimes when I work with 5 or 6 months old still in the snoo and they're not sleeping well, it's like, I think they're just really frustrated. Like they would like to they're trying to practice this thing because it's nice and dark and quiet and like calm. Why not practice at like 2 a.m.? But they can't, right? Because they're kind of still strapped down. So, sort of short answer, I think the snoo is great as long as it's like used appropriately and it's not, you're not using it like forever.
Great, thanks. I'm seeing a question come through and I think we have time for one more. A question about the pacifier and using the pacifier at night and that the baby wakes up when the pacifier falls out. What do you do? What do you do there?
Yeah. So, pacifiers are great. There's nothing wrong with them. That's the question I get also, like, should I not be using a pacifier? What usually happens, which is what's happening with this baby, is that you end up waking up 100 times a night to go pop the pacifier in. At first, it's like kind of annoying. Like, you're like, whatever, but at least I just do that and you go back to sleep and then I can go back to sleep. But it is disrupting everyone's sleep. So at some point for babies using pacifiers, at some point, and that point is really up to the parent and their tolerance for replacing it. You have to decide, like, I will offer you the pacifier. Like, you can have it at bedtime. You can have it before nap time. You can have it, whatever, but you're not replacing it. Right. So you give it to them at bedtime, but that's it. Like, either they have to figure out how to do it themselves, and you can put multiple pacifiers in the crib, or more likely, because babies are smart and efficient, like, why would they go through that trouble? Usually they just end up gnawing on their hands, which is fine. But essentially you're not replacing it. And then you say, okay, if I'm not replacing it, which is situation A, that's my behavior that I'm not doing anymore. What am I going to do instead? So it could be, I'm going to check on you. I'm going to check on you every 5 minutes. I'm going to say hello, but I'm not replacing your pacifier. So again, they're going to get really mad because they're going to be like, come on, pacifier slave, where are you? Like, why are you not replacing this for me? Like, what's going on? They're going to get mad, but then really quickly, they're going to figure out either, oh, I can just get it myself, or I'm just going to chew in my hand or whatever, like stroke the side of the crib or whatever they want to do.
Thank you so much, Hadley. And thank you so much for everybody for joining us today and your engagement and your questions. Please reach out if you have any questions that we weren't able to answer today. And please follow Hadley on Instagram. Hadley, do you want to give out your Instagram information?
Yeah, let me put it in the chat. And we do, there we go. We have tons and tons of sleep tips on Instagram by age, by specific concern. We do a weekly sleep Q&A. So it's a really great place for just information as your child's sleep needs change.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks so much, Hadley. Have a wonderful day.